I hear thunder. Pitter patter. Time to wake up.
If you've watched this far, thanks. Also, you may have noticed that I quite like the Switch. One of my favourite things about it, something that sets it apart from Steam or my PS4, excepting from the obvious, is the lack of a system-level implementation of an achievement system. My Nintendo account doesn't interrupt climactic story moments with notifications, track how complete a game is from a meaningless list, or whatever the fuck these fucking cards are. Nintendo's approach means developers have the choice of whether or not to include a bespoke achievement system unique to the game, or the freedom not to do it if they don't want to. It's just more satisfying to walk away from a game when you feel you're done with it, whether that's level 1, getting to the credits, or 120%ing that bad boy, and not have to see a score out of 1,000 for how much you should have or could have seen. Of course you can ignore it, turn it off, but I just feel better when it's not there at a system level. Let's face it, a lot of achievement hunting is either trivial, look up the random thing or joke the developers wanted to tell, sometimes funny, or straight up mind-numbing grindy time-sink completionism. These defy the definition of achievement, either too random or too low value time effort-wise, and in both cases I probably had to look it up. To be clear, I do think there is a place for this in games, and the satisfaction inherent to fulfilling a checklist is not trivial. See episode 3. Either way, it took me a while to realise that platinuming, getting every possible achievement, might not be worth the time I thought it was growing up. I make an obvious exception for From Software titles because I just can't help myself. So, let's talk about a game, one that wasn't even made by From Software, but one that made me want to platinum it anyway, by virtue of having a reasonable list, and also by being damn excellent. That game is Furi. I have to accept at this point that I'm easily impressed by bright colours. Something about this particular art style really does it for me. I like neon, and I like when games and cartoons use bright colours to present visually arresting or at least pleasing imagery. Call me unconventional. I like the visual design of the environments, different and well considered to complement and enhance the mood of each fight. I like the visual design of the 3D models, at once weighty, real and dangerous seeming, but exaggerated and cartoonish enough to emphasise certain characteristics. Each character feels wholly unique, and they're perfectly animated to convey their characteristics. Look at this crazy thing. Brutal. Over the fight, it transforms from a barely constrained wild animal to a free, scrabbling, not at all constrained wild animal. But everything about how she moves throughout communicates that savagery, that her humanity was left behind a long time ago. The only complaint I have in this department is that in the fights themselves, the animations are usually overshadowed by a sound and the white flash telling you it's time to parry. More on that later. But a purely presentational element being marginalised by a gameplay consideration is rarely a bad thing in my opinion. Then we have the music, and wow. If I had to isolate one single element of Furi as the standout, it would be its fire soundtrack. I'm not a huge fan of synthwave or electronic music so far as I don't often chase new music generally speaking. The Vice City soundtrack got its claws into me and warped my taste forever. So I'd not heard of the handful of artists represented here. But by gum, if after playing Furi even one time, it didn't immediately enter the rotation of about 7 albums I listened to with any regularity. As I listen to each track, I can so perfectly recall to mind its place in the journey. Like the environments, they add another layer to the overall ambience and mood of a scene so beautifully. It's hard to even imagine Furi having much personality without them. Ever present, but somehow never too much. I don't have too much else to say about it, though it could probably support an analysis of its own. You'll be hearing excerpts throughout the video, so please judge for yourselves. Their inclusion may be dwindling, but I always feel a strange affection towards boss rushes. Having said that, I rarely have the patience to replay the whole game again in boss form, even if they are often the highlights of games for me. But what if a game was built from the ground up with a proper tension curve and everything? No grinding, no padding, no fat, no end exam for mastering mechanics. The game is the exam, no frills. Intriguing, no? Furi is far from the first game to do away with standard enemies. an extremely notable example being the generation-defining Shadow of the Colossus, where in between killing beautiful giants, Wander does little other than ride his horse around a desolate environment. Here as well, the exclusion of minor encounters is wholly additive for the sake of pacing, the narrative and for the ethereal atmosphere. It just wouldn't be the same if Wander, or the Stranger for that matter, were taking the time to slaughter goblins or whatever. For Furi, it sells the danger and the seriousness of the Stranger's ordeal, and keeps the tension high whenever in combat. No fluff. Nothing is trivial. Nothing is ever easy. For me, this is a vital component for prolonged enjoyment and repeat playthroughs. It's a sad fact of life that anything you do often enough will become humdrum. Even something as extreme and alien to almost all of us as actual armed conflict, with swords and laser pistols no less. Designing Furi as a boss rush means that each and every single fight has the potential for exhilaration every time you finish it. It means I can happily set the game to speedrun, cut out all those walkie-talkie sections, and bash out a full, satisfying playthrough in just over an hour. There aren't many games that deliver a full, complete feeling package in a single sitting. To me, this in no way represents bad value though. Furi is hard, and your first time through will take much longer than an hour. Don't worry about that. I don't normally advocate so hard for this, but it's undeniable that for good and ill, in Furi's case, you have to earn your experience. At its core, Furi is a touch unforgiving, though much less than it could have been. It's about repetition, and the achievement of excellence through habituation. One of the characters outright says this at one point. It better have some damn good mechanics to back up this demand. And, it kinda does. I strongly believe that love is about the acceptance of flaws, so let me be frank when I say Furi's combat mechanics are not the best you'll find. It lacks the precision of a Soulsborne and the balls-to-the-wall combo potential of a Platinum. It feels stodgy at first. The Stranger is actually kind of slow to move manually, particularly while firing his weapon. And thus the main defensive verb apart from the parry is a chargeable dodge. This thing might actually be the steepest learning curve in Furi, as tapping the dodge is almost certainly not going to zap you forward far enough to avoid what's coming at you. Learning the precise rhythm of how long to hold the button to position the Stranger is a vital ingredient for success. Furthermore, you are locked into whatever direction you're facing when you release the button, and hey, guess what? Things are moving on screen pretty much all the time. It's therefore not uncommon to dash into something dangerous, and your invincibility frames are rather tight. Thus, an above average level of situational awareness is called for, a neat blend of muscle memory and reaction speed, tough but representative of Furi as a whole. There are essentially two modes to combat, the initial freer part, where the focus is on shooting and avoiding all manner of attacks, and in an extremely bullet hell fashion, though melee defense and sword attacks are still important. The gun also has a charge shot, but its use is rather limited as the Stranger must be stationary to shoot it, making it a big risk. Then there are the more intense, melee-focused, close-quarter combat sections that happen at the end of almost every phase. You can charge your sword here for quick damage or hold down the attack button, similar to the charge shot, for massive albeit slow damage. The main challenge here is balancing defense against when to punish the enemy, as they are always vulnerable to counterattack when they pause between attack waves. Finally, we have what might be somewhat of a signature for Furi, the universal fast and reliable parry. As mentioned, parryable melee attacks are always heralded by both visual and audio cues, but they come fast. You can also at a mere button press deflect more ranged attacks than you might think, though this is even more difficult than learning the standard parry timing, introducing further risk rewards. Some parts are just rhythm reaction challenge, but so what, that sort of game will always feel good to master for me. From Thumper to Beat Saber to Guitar Hero back in the day. I'm certain it taps into the same parts of your brain that activate when you excel at a dance or a sport. Sadly I wouldn't know. But all the same, satisfying as all get out, as you learn, improve and eventually master. And those are essentially all the mechanics in the game. Shoot, slash, dodge, parry. It's a limited verb set, but when it all comes together it is fit for purpose. In a way it's perfect in its simplicity, and in other ways certainly not. Something I'm noticing in this analysis is how many binary choices there are. 2 of course being the smallest number of options in any given situation, thus lubricating decisions in a game that obviously emphasizes speed. It's no more complicated than it needs to be, and that is something I personally value. I honestly can't imagine anyone is going to pick this up for its hard-hitting narrative, because there isn't one. At least not one typical of the medium. Action games aren't the place to go for strong stories. Some would even argue somewhat convincingly that video games are not a valid medium for compassionate storytelling in the first place, or that games are universally better without a story at all. I essentially reject both of these, but they are topics for another time. For what it sets out to do, the simple narrative happening mostly behind the scenes in Furi is more interesting than it needs to be. I'm loath to bring it up again, but it does that amazing thing that Dark Souls did. A story that gets better and better the more you think about it. It's such a rare thing. A slow burn that doesn't fizzle out or tie itself in knots of inconsistency and contradiction. A casual read suggests one anime-ass protagonist carving his way through a series of guardians to escape from jail. An alien invader whose touch alone brings death, who at the last minute has a convenient change of heart and decides to save his former captor's world. Or doesn't, if you want to skip the last fight, up to you. However, our hero never speaks, instead our ears are full of this guy, the voice, ostensibly one of the guardians, or so he pretends, but actually the master manipulator behind your escape and thus responsible for the death of each of them at your hand. He's portrayed as weary, introspective and a little sarcastic, but ultimately savvy and optimistic. You see, he knows, or assumed, or guessed, that the Guardians could not contain the stranger forever, and from where he came so more would come. So he set his efforts to building an enormous prison, and set up a gauntlet of antagonists, not with any real hope of stopping you, he knows that's impossible, but to make the stranger think. That's why he won't shut up. He's presenting as convincing a case as he could to the stranger to show him that his people did not deserve to die. He took a huge gamble, sacrificing his kind's best warriors to save the person he cares about the most. It all pivots around this one scene, hidden in the walking section after boss number 9. His last act before the finale is to obliquely confess and put the ball in the stranger's court. But there you go. It's touching, elegant and minimalist story design. Another example of Furi's efficiency.
I hoped it would change you. I think it did. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is what you are going to do.
Talking about these elements separately is odd, because although it's very competent at all of them, none of them are especially best in show, except for the soundtrack. But that's games, right? All elements serve the nebulous concept of the experience. The thumping music makes the blood pump, the difficulty sells you on the desperation, the characters, their barks and their dialogue sell you on the quiet, dignified sadness of its world. All the while the fuchsia and electric blue tones lend a needed sense of levity and makes it easy on the eyes. It's this tight, beautiful ball of design, nothing wasted, nothing poking out. This ethos is even echoed in the aforementioned achievements. To Platinum Fury, I have finished the game on its second difficulty. I have finished one and only one fight perfectly. I have set a speedrun record, and I have achieved the top rank on both difficulties, not so difficult when the stats are averaged over the whole game. There were a few bullshitty bits on the way, but I would have seen the endings anyway, and the trivial ones at least hide extra dialogue for the most part. Once again, I am grateful to Furi for its relative brevity, because each of the 5 major achievements I mentioned felt like a step on the path to mastery and conclusion of this otherwise somewhat shallow action game. And there you go, completionism, dedication, downright charming visuals, the music, the feel of the thing in your hands, the context of the battles, and feeling that every single fight, every phase, every hit has a gravity and importance all on its own. I honestly can't think to separate a favourite moment any more than I can the best song on the soundtrack. I'm just so impressed that everything hangs together so well. It feels authored so deliberately, in a way that generally only indie projects can manage, and almost never with this level of depth. It's taught me an awful lot about why I play games in the first place. It's not the best game I've ever played, it wasn't even the best that year, but for the 6 months on and off that I spent with it, it was very special. It engaged me, it made me care about what was happening in it, and it kept giving back the more and more I put into it, until, having achieved everything it asked, I was done. For me, games might be superior on paper, but gaming doesn't get better. No. This DLC puts me in mind of when they released music by dead people. I mean, if Jimi Hendrix or Michael Jackson wanted people to hear their unreleased stuff, they probably would have released it. Or deleted scenes on DVDs might be a better analogy. They were deleted for a goddamn reason. Fuck this thing. And fuck Skyrim, just by the way. See you next season.